Hello and welcome to Really Cool People, a podcast produced by Schweitzer Church. I'm your host, Jason Lanier. This is a place to hear stories of really cool people. And it's the hope that as we listen to those stories, you and I will be inspired, encouraged, and challenged through moments of serendipity. In a moment entitled The Weight of Glory, C.S. Lewis said, "There are no ordinary people. You and I have never talked to a mere mortal." It's my joy over the next few moments to introduce you to somebody who, for all intents and purposes, may seem fairly normal. And yet, when you hear their story, you find out that they are a really cool person. Today, we're going to meet Keith Breithaupt. Keith is going to describe his story in the early part as something that is the story of a fatherless person. And yet, when he gets to the end of his story, he's going to also call that story good. So you're going to want to lean in. Get ready. Let's hear Keith Breithaupt's story. Well, today we're glad to welcome Keith Breithaupt into the studio. And so, Keith, let's start with your story.
Well, thanks, Jason. Glad to be here. I'm going to open up with a scripture here. I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you have troubles. But take heart. I have overcome the world. I was the third child in my family, three. I was fortunate enough to grow up with my brother in my grandparents' home. Now that elicits a couple questions right off the bat. I had a sister also who I never knew. My sister was the first, and she was killed by a drunk driver when she was about 2 or 3 months old in my parents' vehicle. They were hit by a drunk driver. So I never knew her. I grew up in my grandparents' home. My father left our family when I was about 2.5. That made my brother about 4. There's more to that story also. My father was a Methodist pastor. And I didn't know him, I didn't get to know him until I was about 40 years old. There's a lot of stuff in between. Some people, what I was going to say there is that I was a fatherless person in that time where that wasn't real common. Today, that's more common, and I'm not speaking to those who divorce. I'm not putting that onus on anybody. But I never could understand how a parent or a father could leave his infant children. And I'll let you think about that. Now, I was blessed by the fact that my grandparents took us in, and they were godly people. My grandfather was a godly man, hardworking man, and I knew what that leather strap was used for rather than sharpening your razor. There's another purpose for that, and I was grateful for that because he helped me walk the way I should have walked. Wasn't going to use that term fairly normal childhood because I just told you some things that may not necessarily be normal in most people's lives. But like I said, I was blessed I had 2 uncles in the home part of the time along with my grandparents. And I became very, very comfortable in dealing with older people, if I can say that kindly, because, I have my grandparents, and I was very comfortable with them. I was less comfortable with men, besides my grandfather. I don't know if I was intimidated, but a lot of the time during the raising was my grandmother and my aunt who took care of me. My mother was working, of course, so she wasn't there most of the time. And so I had my grandmother and my aunt taking care of me, which was a true blessing. And my aunt was a nurse. and probably led to some of my medical career. At one time, I wanted to be a physician, but the other part of me didn't want to go to school that long. So I became a pharmacist instead, which I don't regret. One of those things. So we can maybe segue into another part of this story. When I was about 40 years old, Karen had seen advertised, I'm not even sure exactly, the genealogy of the Breithaupts. You can imagine I had no use for that. I didn't care about that. But she sent off for this book. Well, she sent off for this book, and of course it had my dad, Gerald Breithaupt, listed. And I'd always heard that he was in California through different conversations, probably with his mother, my grandmother. And sure enough, he was listed in there, living in California. And during that time was the time of Promise Keepers, for those who remember the Promise Keeper times. And I had attended several of the Promise Keepers. And I always had a Tuesday morning prayer time, and we had a men's group of 3 or 4 men that met together. Very good friend. He was a second career pastor. He was a baseball coach, and a very good friend of mine. And it was coming upon Easter time, and he said to me, "Wouldn't it be great if your dad heard from his son on Easter?" Now, I've already told you I had his address. So I guess I was convinced to go ahead with that conversation, to send some correspondence. I sent him an Easter card, but I was protecting my family, and I didn't use my own address. I used the address of the church. So I always call this word picture as a march to the mailbox. If you can imagine this, my inner self was fighting against me, like, why am I doing this? This is going to be worthless. He's going to throw that in the trash can. Why am I even doing this? So I call that the march to the mailbox. When I flung that letter in there and slammed the box shut, I just knew it was worthless. So a week or so later, I don't even know how long it was, I have a good friend at church who was the administrator there. I already told you I addressed the return address through the church's address. It was a Saturday morning, and my friend, smiling ear to ear, comes to the counter and puts a first-class envelope, or air mail envelope, on the counter. And I could see where it came from. And I stood there frozen for a minute, not knowing what to do. But eventually I opened it. And, I think it was kind of a general thing, like, oh, so good to hear from you, this type of thing. If you'd care to write me back, he included his address, which I already had, but he included that, and went on from there. And I was a little bit shocked. Now, you have to know that my brother was in the same situation. He had had no contact with him. And as recently as yesterday, when my dad reached out to him, what he did with the first letter was he trashed it. He didn't even read it. He threw it in the trash can. Sent him another letter, and that one he read. And that broke the ice for him. So that gives you a little snapshot of what was going on there. I guess why I open up with the scripture that I read. We're not promised, a bed of roses. There's going to be some thorns in there. I'll go back just a little bit, and we can pick up on this story later. I already had one son. I had 3 children. I had 4 children. My first was a boy. Second was a girl. Third was a boy. Fourth was a girl. it was April 1st, and I was working at that time in Arnold, Missouri. My phone rang. It was Karen, and she was about 5 weeks out. And she tells me on the phone that her water is broke. I knew that probably wasn't a good thing, but so one of those things happen. So I leave. The store manager said, "Get out of here," and I left. It took me about 45 minutes to get home. And sure enough, water is broken, so we headed to the hospital. Well, 5 weeks early, Karen delivers a baby girl who had a cleft palate and cleft lip, which we had no inkling. Sonograms were done. She had a sonogram, but we didn't know that. So that was a shock to us, to both of us. But I had returned home. I decided to go home for a little bit. And I get another call. Karen calls me from the hospital saying I better get back there. I said, okay. I didn't ask a lot of questions. I just took the hint and got back there. When I got back there, they were transporting Lauren to the children's hospital. She had got good scores when she was born. I think she got an 8. And they were transporting her back to the hospital because something wasn't right. Yeah, something was not right. So I drove myself over to the children's hospital that really is just across town. And things were not good. They were had to bag her. They were the physician. I'll tell you about him. He looked like a little teenager, about 100 pounds, skinny. And I'm thinking, what is this guy doing here? And I can tell you right now, he's the most wonderful person you'll ever want to meet. Dedicated. He was going to be there through the whole fight. So during this process, of course, we called Karen's mom and dad, who picked up my mom that came to the hospital. Karen's stepdad was a pastor also. And my pediatrician showed up in the there, he was a good friend of mine, and he showed up. Long story short, Lauren died. She lived for 11 hours. Her dad baptized her. And this was, get the timing off, is right at Easter time. I think Easter had this is the way it happened. Easter had occurred. This was a Wednesday. So she died the Wednesday after Easter that year. And the funeral was on Friday, I believe. So here comes my scripture lesson again. Things are not always rosy. And to use the word normal, I'm not sure I wanted to use that term. Okay, I'll jump from that story back to my dad. So during this time we were corresponding back and forth. Now it was around Christmas time, in between Christmas and New Year's, we decided that we needed to go to California. So I made that, I think I wrote him a letter, told him we're considering coming out there, which created a problem for me, not so much for my mom. My mom was living. And I always had that frame of mind to honor your mother and your father. So I was taking my mom back and forth to a diabetologist. She was diabetic. And one day we were coming back home from the appointment, and I reached between the seat where I had a letter from my dad, and I handed it to her. And tears streamed down her face. And she said to me, "You owe it to yourself to meet your dad." I told her right then, I said, if you tell me no, it's over, I'm done, I'll stop. Because I honored her enough to not proceed if that's her wishes. And she told me, no, I owed it to myself to meet my dad. So I told you it was already between Christmas and New Year's. Karen and myself got on the plane. We just sat down in our seats, and here comes the stewardess down the hall with a kind of a grimacing look on her face, like, oh, you guys have messed up. She points at us and says, you come with me. Kind of in that tone. Had no idea what that meant. So we got up, got our baggage, and followed her up. She took us to a first-class seat. That was affirmation that we were doing the right thing. I'll take you back to another affirmation that I got after we had decided to go to California. I was sitting at the kitchen table one day. Karen wasn't home, making arrangements for the flight, for the trip out there. And I just got done. This was days of the phone. We didn't have our cell phone. You had to call to make the arrangement. I just got done, and I was feeling so good, and I went to the kitchen sink, probably get a drink of water. And a bird that had not been there before, was not there afterward, started singing. And I knew what that meant. It touched me in the heart. Wasn't there before, wasn't there afterwards. And this bird started to sing. I know that might stretch some of your beliefs, but I can tell you how real that was. Right after that, I got a phone call from our church office, from her secretary, telling me that my mother was just involved in a serious auto accident. And of course, my mind thought immediately, well, there goes that plan, So she was in a serious auto accident, but it ended up, when she was released, she was bad enough hurt that she had to go to a nursing home type facility to take care of her for some period of time, which would thus allow us to go to California. It wasn't my plan, but that's how it worked out. So we went to California, where we have arrived. We flew into it. My dad lived in North San Francisco. I didn't fly into San Francisco. Same reason I didn't address the envelope with my address. I was protecting our family. We flew into San Jose, California, and drove up to San Francisco. So we were sitting in the car. Me and Karen says, what do you do if he slams the door in your face? I said, well, I'll smile. I'll go home because I know I've been faithful for what I've been told to do. And I have no regrets. We went to the door. We were received warmly. Karen, if you ask her, will comment that our mannerisms are similar. We look alike. That type of thing. We had a very nice weekend. We went out to dinner with him that night. And he had his stepsister with him. He told me later was a protection for him in case things didn't go well. They could get out of that. But things went very well. And thanks to my very good friends at home, they took care. I had 3 children at home that took care of them. I'll tell you one other bit of information there. We didn't communicate with Karen's parents for the simple reason that we felt like this was the right thing to do, and we didn't want anybody to try to talk us out of going because they knew of him, etc., and we didn't want that conversation. What we did do is write him a letter and try to time it so they would receive the letter after we had left. And that's exactly what we did. Right, wrong, or indifferent. Because that's just the way we felt. So my dad then returned, came to the St. Louis area. He came to visit. A year or two later, met all my kids. We took him to a Cardinal baseball game, etc. And there's part of that story.
We'll jump into that more in a little bit. How about your later life? What's Keith's life been like as you've grown older and your kids have grown up and left the house? And
my life has been tremendous, really. I have no complaints, Jason. Talking about some of those difficulties, and I think that's the way I wanted to present it. Life is sometimes difficult. It's not the way that we want it to be. I'm married to my childhood sweetheart. I've been married to 46 years, so I think you just, when I look at that part of it, I have 3 tremendous kids. I have 6 grandkids. So life is great. And now I get to spend time with them, spend time with my grandkids, and get to travel. I got one son that lives in Oxford, Mississippi. So life is great. I enjoyed my professional career. I was a pharmacist for 37 years, I think. And I was pharmacy manager for all that time, except for 3 years when I was down in Arnold. And so I've been very blessed. I've been involved in medical mission trip for over 20 years. Our church had decided to be involved in mission, and they thought going to Paraguay was the place to go. And we returned there for over 20 years. And I've been a pharmacist in Paraguay for over 20 years. So my life has been good.
that's a really interesting term to describe kind of the fullness of your life, because good, that's a word that we generally use. It's pretty common parlance throughout most of the common language and common talk of today. But good is a word that theologically has also been used to describe God. In fact, good, true, and beautiful are what St. Thomas Aquinas used as the markers of the Trinity. And so good is a deeply held theological word, and the definition for good, which St. Thomas does with the other things, is to say that good is the fulfillment or the fullness of things that are both true and beautiful. And then things that are true are good and beautiful, and things that are beautiful are true and good. I mean, he's got this unique, very, very Trinitarian, reliant kind of understanding there. So good is deeply theological as well as common parlance. And so it's fascinating that when you began starting, you kind of jumped into the story of you as a kid. You described yourself as a fatherless person. And then you come to the place where you go, I've lived a good life. That's a heck of a journey.
I guess I look at the good aspects of it more than the bad. I told you I had a godly grandfather who I loved greatly, deeply. He was a guy of that generation that didn't speak a lot, but when he did, you better be paying attention because he was telling you something very important. He was of German descent. I think his parents came over on the boat, and he was determined to be a German American, not to teach his children German. Well, I had a deep interest. I took German. I still speak German. And when I was taking German in high school, he then spoke to me in German. And I would have that conversation with him. Only me. He would not speak outside of it.
Wow.
So I treasure that memory.
That's really awesome that he would do that for you and with you. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about your dad, because you mentioned that he left at 2.5, and then you had this journey to find him, and um, you also said he was a Methodist pastor, so that goes in there somewhere. Like there's a degree of spirituality and spiritual questions along with that. Um, did you ever find out why your dad left at 2.5?
Jason, there's so much information that I do not know, and that's one of those questions. I was privy to read some personal letters between him and my mother. It shed a little light, but not a lot of light. So the answer is, I really don't know. He was a graduate of Asbury Seminary.
Well, don't hold that against all of us.
No, I try not to. I hold it in high regard, truthfully. But it makes me question. I'll jump into just a short little story. It gives you another perspective of what happened here. I was in high school, either a junior or senior in high school. And this is a time that we only had landlines. So the phone, when it rang, it was the house phone.
Yeah.
The house phone rang. It was fairly late. I was in bed. My mom was in bed. But I could hear from my bedroom this conversation that was going on, and I could kind of understand what was happening. What was happening was my dad's next wife, I use that term, was calling my mom because he was doing the same thing to her as he had done to my mother. He was leaving his next family. I think he had 2 children at that time. And my mom, I give her credit. I could hear her comforting this lady who she did not know. I could hear her comforting her in the best way that she could. And I'll always remember that. So you can see the pattern. I think I have told you, Jason, one time that one story that my mom had told me that during his training at Asbury, he had a psychological test, and the person, one of his professors, came to her sometime later and said that this test showed that he would never be stable in relationships, for what it's worth. Now, it proved out to be that way, which I find interesting. She only told me that once, and moved on. And so it seemed like that was the case.
When you found him at around the age of 40, was he still pastoring then?
I think he might have been doing some fill-in work at different churches. But his main job was not the church. He was in a building maintenance operation, janitorial type work at that time. And he had mentioned, a couple of things that he had filled in at different churches. So, but that wasn't his main job.
How did that reality speak to your own soul and to your own walk with Christ? I mean, because for some people that deep connection that a trusted loved one has with God can color their image of God in a very different light or way than what you've represented and you've come away with.
Well, I'll answer the question. I'll come around the backside and then I'll answer your question directly.
Okay.
One of my least favorite days of the year was Father's Day. I just couldn't wait for that day to be done. Because I had an aunt who really wasn't my aunt at all, but was a very close individual that was close to one of his pastorates near Champaign, Illinois. And I would say, "Oh, I don't have a father." She'd always correct me and say, "No, you have one." And my dad was one of these guys that everybody liked. Everybody I had met afterwards, and a couple pastors that knew my dad, would always tell me how they really liked Jerry. which never meshed with me. I couldn't figure that out. Like, how can you like a guy that leaves his family like that? But anyway, getting back to your question, Jason, how that I did have some trouble in, when we talk about our Heavenly Father, to correlate those two things was always a little difficult for me. Like, no, I don't really understand a father's love. I don't. I understand grandfather's love, but a father's love and my Heavenly Father's love, I don't truly understand. And I think it was a work in progress that I was determined. One of the things I was determined not to do is what my dad did. I was determined to be, if I got married, I was going to be focused, and I'd do everything I could to stay with my wife and be loyal to my family. Maybe to a fault at times, if that's possible, but for what it's worth. So I struggled with it a little bit. But, as you read Scripture more, it talks to you more and more like, you hear people say, the Father loves you. Well, that kind of fell on deaf ears for me for a long time. Like, I don't know that really. I've been told that, I read that, but in my heart, do I really believe it? So it was a question.
Did you ever come across J.I. Packer in his book, Knowing God?
I don't think so, Jason.
He speaks to that reality because he knows that a lot of people have got and I think he uses the term like a father wound or something like that in their life. And he said, some of us get to experience great fathers and we can understand the Father's love. And some of us don't. And he said, and yet, even in the absence thereof, we can begin to imagine what we would really like and what we would expect. And those are the indicators of what God's love as a father for us is like.
On the backside of that, when I had children, I could understand a father's love from my point of view that also emphasized the other part, like, how could that happen? How could you ever leave your family because of my love for my children? I would do everything I could to keep them on the right path and teach them the things I knew. So.
Well, let's lighten this up just a little bit.
All right.
Okay. As a kid, what were some of your favorite activities to do as a kid?
Oh, I was a sports kid. Loved playing sports. Played football, baseball. Not so much soccer. Soccer wasn't a thing when I grew up. But loved to do that. Loved to swim. My mom would teach summer school at the nearby city, which was Carlisle, Illinois. Some people know that by Carlisle Lake, largest Illinois man-made lake. And me and my brother would go swimming every day during the summer. Every day we'd go to the local pool there and swim. We loved to do that. Kevin was a good diver. I was too chicken. I didn't do some of the stuff he did because I saw him wipe out. I didn't want to do that. But we enjoyed the heck out of that.
I'd like to see Kevin dive today.
He was about the same build he was back then as he is now, so it would be entertainment. What a great guy.
Yeah, he is. One of the things that I know about you and Kevin is, and especially, Kevin does this, but the two of you, I've seen you work together. Like, you like to make food. So did that come about when you were kids?
Well, I always liked barbecue, and I have an uncle right up the street from me that barbecue on Sundays and things, and I love that. And I'd help him do that and learn how to do some of that. And that just carried on through my adult life. When I had my own family, I loved to barbecue, loved to churn ice cream, because what kid doesn't like ice cream, especially homemade?
That's right.
And so I love that part of it. And I guess that's part, and Kevin was really good. He cooked for thousands. He had a ministry called Cooking for Christ, and he taught me how to do some things like brisket. I can make you a mean brisket. I give him credit for that. So yeah, I enjoy doing that today for sure.
Yeah. You mentioned when you talked about your grandfather that he was a godly guy, and you also mentioned that you knew what a belt was. So I imagine that there's some interesting stories around discipline. Did you ever get disciplined for something you thought wasn't as bad as it seemed?
No, I knew when I got it, I deserved it. And speaking of, you know, it could be a weird arrangement, I guess, because my grandfather allowed my mother to parent.
Uh-huh.
But, when things were out of control, when I saw him get up, I knew I was in trouble because he usually wouldn't intervene. But when he did, you usually knew what was coming. And I don't regret that. I think that's the best thing ever happened to me, probably.
Yeah. Did you ever work for your grandpa where he paid you money?
I did not. I did some chores, around the house. I mowed the grass and things like that, but, kind of expected things. I never did work for him. He was a carpenter by trade, and he was good. People would come from miles around to have their saws sharpened, and I would spend hours hanging around with him, sharpening saws and doing stuff like that. He was an intriguing guy. He could do anything. My uncle was the same way. People would come to him like, Frank, I don't know how to do this. And Frank did. He did it.
Wow.
Yeah. So I had great examples.
Some great people to grow up around.
Yeah, really did.
How did you then, out of that, determine that you were going to become a pharmacist?
Well, I had two aunts who were both nurses. So I felt like it wasn't cool for me, Jason. I don't say things bad about male nurses today. They're great. Mm-hmm. But to me at that time, that wasn't a thing. And I didn't want to be a nurse per se, nothing against nursing, but I knew I wanted to be in the medical field. And I told you earlier, I determined that I didn't want to spend that much time to become a doctor. That's really the reason. And so I applied to pharmacy school my junior year of high school and was accepted. I made good grades. I was a good student. And so I went to St. Louis College of Pharmacy in St. Louis.
I can appreciate that, being tired of school. I mean, I've spent plenty of time in school, but I think I can appreciate that as well. You talked about Karen and talked about her in some different spaces. You said she was your childhood sweetheart. And so you remember your first date?
Not my first date. She'll tell you this story. She's got this very vividly, and I remember it or not so much. I remember putting my hand in her coat pocket with her hand in there the first time. And the first date, I don't necessarily remember that. But to give you a little background, like I told you already, her stepfather was a Methodist pastor, and he was the pastor in our town. And I think they moved there. Karen might have been in 8th grade or maybe a junior. She's 18 months older than I am. She was actually in my brother's class. And so that's how that interaction came about. Shattuck's a very small town, maybe 150 people at its peak. It's not near that now. So you can see how that occurred.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What are some things that, before you guys had kids, that you guys would really love to do together?
Well, we got married when I had 3 years of pharmacy school left. Karen had just graduated from nursing school. So we loved hanging out together, but she was I did work part-time at a pharmacy close to us in St. Louis, but she was a sole breadwinner more or less, and she got paid once a month. So toward the end of the month, things were nip and tuck, sometimes tuck one. So when my mother-in-law would call and ask if we would come over for dinner, that was an automatic yes. Yeah, here we come. So, but we enjoyed doing all kinds of things. We'd go to the fair in St. Louis on the riverfront. That was a thing back then. So we did that and anything else, Jason. I can't think of anything specifically right off the top of my head.
You haven't quite said it exactly, but you've indicated that Illinois was kind of the land of your upbringing, and then also I know you worked in Illinois, lived in Illinois for a long time. How did you ever find your way to Missouri and down into around Springfield?
That's a question I'm asked a lot. Well, and the answer is simple. I had two children that attended SMS. Well, my first son did it when there was SMS, and then my daughter, Leah, she attended Missouri State. And of course, as things happen, they find their mates down here, and they were both married. And so the grandchildren are here, of course. So that's where Opa and Oma come. They want to move. When I retired, we built a log home in Niangua, and it's been wonderful.
Mm-hmm. Do you see your kids and grandkids very often?
All the time. The one here and my son's kid, they live in Nixa, so close. And my daughter's just a few blocks from the church here, so we see them a lot. Grandma's called on a lot when they're sick, or when we're here on Tuesdays, she'll run over there to take care of the sick kids or whatever. But yeah, we do. We see them a lot, and that's a good thing.
So, move down here, see your grandkids. But I see a lot of Keith and Karen around Schweitzer Church. On Tuesdays and Wednesdays, you guys volunteer in the food pantry. I've seen you here Tuesday nights because you're doing pickleball. You're here Wednesday nights because you're in a group. And then you're on the Flourish board. So this coming Thursday, you and I are going to be together. I mean, you spend a lot of time around here. I don't believe you're retired.
That's what somebody asked me one time about retirement. I said that it ties in with availability. I never had that when I was working. Would you like to do this? That's not the right question. Yeah, I would like to do that, but I can't because work interferes with a lot of things. So that's the most important thing that I really enjoy is availability. When somebody says, "Can you do so and so?" I go, "Well, absolutely. Yeah, I can do that." We started working at the pantry on Tuesdays during COVID, and it just really talked to me that Freddie needed help on Wednesdays. So then pretty soon after that, I started working Tuesdays and Wednesdays. And what a group of people, what a group of friends we have developed there. We have a lot of fun. I always think that fun is a great thing to do. And you mentioned pickleball. That's a great fun. Have a lot of fun there. People ask why you play. I said, well, it's a social sport. You get to talk to everybody, and I've got to know a lot of people that way. And I think that's the window of opportunity for evangelism, really. Mm-hmm. You're seeing that people are, say, outside the church that come to play pickleball, saying, those guys are kind of friendly. They're all right. If they had a bad impression of Christians, I hope that changes their mind.
Well, I don't know what kind of an impression you leave on people at pickleball, because you got one of the wickedest serves that I've ever tried to return. It's pretty severe. I mean, there's fun, there's competitive, and you put it all in there, all in the one package. Serve it up.
Like I told you, I love sports. I played baseball as a youngster, was never that great at it, but I still loved it. And I competed, but I couldn't compete at a real high level. So, I haven't played baseball for a long time. Played softball in church for a while and enjoyed that too. Yeah. But it's all what you have fun at.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
If we were gonna go jump in your truck that's out here, what's on the radio? What do you listen to?
A lot of people, a while back, I think Spencer talked about, going to somebody's home and they have Christian music on or that type of thing. I'm not a real big praise person. Usually I have Pandora on. I like hymns of the church. I grew up with that. That's normal for me. So if you got in my truck, I didn't put it on special for you. It's what I listened to. And I can sing along. Good thing it's usually by myself, so it's all good. I make a joyful noise anyway.
There you go.
Yeah.
That's pretty. That's what the Lord asks of us, right? A joyful noise.
Right.
Yeah. And he's the one who crafted our voices. So whatever it is, that's what comes.
You get what you made, Lord.
That's right.
Yeah. Oh, my.
Oh, my goodness. You talked about the influence of your grandfather, and now you get to play the part of a grandfather. What kinds of things do you hope your grandkids, or what do you think they're picking up from you? What's your legacy that you're giving and leaving for them?
Pretty easy question for me. I want to leave them with integrity, honesty, and the top of that list is to know the Lord, their Lord as Savior and Redeemer. That really is and I'm not pushing in that regard, but we have conversations. I have a 12-year-old grandson that we have conversation. He was baptized this year, and he called me and says, Grandpa, I'm going to be baptized this Sunday. I said, I'll be there. No question, it was a big thing for him. But integrity and the way you live your life is important to me, and I hope I exemplify that. I hope I show them that by action. That, like you talked about being here at church, I don't think a whole lot about that, Jason, except that I'm available. I can do that, and it's my offering, I think. So I hope they learn that.
Well, I'd say they've got some pretty big shoes to follow in. So,
we already talked about a little bit that I didn't want to leave my legacy like my father and grandfather both did. I didn't want that legacy. I thought that was a smear on our name. Even though I told you that all his acquaintances or people in his church loved him. Mm-hmm. Some of the fruit that was displayed, I didn't like, if I can say that in a Christian way.
You can. A final question. Oftentimes like to ask people, what's a word of advice, a final greeting you'd like to have for us?
Thought about that question a lot. One of my favorite scriptures, I have two, is Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and don't lean on your own understandings, as my life story tells you here. But in all your ways acknowledge him, and he'll direct your paths. He directed my path. I told you about the little bird. You can think about that. Mm-hmm. And then Ephesians 3:20 that says, and to him who is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all we ask or think, according to the power that lives in him. I think about those two verses. I hope that portrays me. I'm kind of a funny guy most of the time. But deep down, when you look past those layers, you see my story, and it becomes more serious, I guess. And I don't like to show that most of the time.
I think what it shows is something that was captured in a song a couple of years ago, actually more than a decade ago now. It said, God makes beautiful things out of dust. And so often, so many times in our lives, there are places where we think it's all just dust and there's what can come out of this. And yet if we walk, as you mentioned from Proverbs, God can do some beautiful things out of dust.
Absolutely. One of my favorite hymns is Because He Lives. Mm-hmm. And the refrain says, I know He holds my future. And life is worth the living because He lives. And that's true.
Yeah. Thanks, Keith.
Thanks, Jason, for having me.
You are one really cool guy.
Depends who you ask, Jason.
Well, a big thanks to Keith for sharing his story. In listening to Keith, hope and pray that you were inspired, encouraged, and challenged, and that you begin to behold the really cool people that are around you each and every day. The Really Cool People podcast is produced by Schweitzer Church, Springfield, Missouri. Taylor Likes is our executive producer and editor, and I'm your host, Jason Leininger. You can help us by liking, reviewing, and sharing this podcast. Until next time, stay cool.